How did people go from the Tower of Babel to different parts of the world? I mean, first off, they probably didn't get in a nice helicopter and fly to where they were going to go to. Now, they could easily travel across land, whether they're taking animals. They could have had carts and all sorts of things. They're initially at Babel. A lot of places they can easily walk to. Europe, Africa, Asia. Yeah, they have to deal with terrain and rivers and things like that, but they should easily be able to get to a lot of these places. But what about places like Australia, or you go out to the British Isles, or Japan, or maybe even the Americas? How did people get there? Well, most creationists believe that there was an ice age that was triggered by the flood of Noah's day. A lot of these researchers have the ice age peaking around 500 years after the flood, so this would have been after the events at the Tower of Babel. The Tower of Babel, according to the Bible, occurred in the days of Peleg. Well, Peleg was born 101 years after the flood. He died before Noah actually died, according to the genealogies. So kind of right in there. A lot of people have placed it about 100 years or around there after the flood. I think Archbishop Usher, he placed it at 106 years after the flood, 5 years after the birth of Peleg, and he did that for a historical reason. But that just gives you kind of the time frame of when this occurred. So with the peak of the Ice Age being 500 years after that, that's during the migrations of people to different parts of the world, at least the initial migrations. Now, obviously, if they're closer to Babel, we can start to trace them. The Greeks go out to what we know as Greece today. Egypt or Mitzrayim went down to what we know as Egypt today. And, it was like that in ancient times. And then, of course, their descendants, people continue to go further. And we can actually trace a lot of those migration routes. Ashkenaz, who was the founder of the Germans, he actually settled north of the Black Sea. And there was kind of right in an area right in there. Some of his descendants came back south of the Black Sea, but he ended up migrating to the northern part of Central Europe. And he took 20 dukes, or 20 of his sons, essentially with him. One of them was Danius. That's where the Danes came from. So we can actually trace some of those particular lineages. Now, with the Ice Age in full swing, what that does is it takes a lot of water out of the ocean and it places it on land. And what that does is it takes your ocean level and it drops it a little bit. People could have actually walked all the way out to England. They could have walked all the way out to Japan because it exposes land bridges. The North Sea, much of that area was formerly known as Dodger Land. And sometimes old maps, even in the 1700s, they have Dodger Hills and some of these areas that are out in the North Sea that are marshy because it's so shallow, even during the medieval warming period. So imagine during the Ice Age when it was even lower. We actually find artifacts that are pulled out of the North Sea where people used to settle in some of those particular areas. Well, it also opens up a land bridge all the way to North and South America. Going from basically, up there, Siberia, where Russia is, where it would essentially connect to Alaska. So, great migrations could have occurred through those directions, potentially all the way to Australia. Now, it's a little deeper in some of those areas, getting down to Australia, at least it is today. Now, there's a lot of tectonic activity. We see resultant tsunamis even in our own day and age, which has shifted the seafloor. So it's possible it was a little more shallow, but, allowing animals and people to get there. But let's also not forget that people could go by boat. In Genesis chapter 10, it talks about the coastline people, the maritime people, the people who went by boat. The Greeks went to all these different islands. The Phoenicians went, all over the place. They were known for trading and taking people to various parts of the world. But do you realize people also took animals all over the place? If we look back at ancient Roman records, they brought, certain animals to different parts of the world. They were known to trade animals. They would take them all over the place. During the age of exploration, if rats were not all over the world, we took them there because they hopped off of our boats and ended up all sorts of places. So, a lot of animals have been taken by people to various parts of the world as well. So that helps explain animal migration, people migration. So we do see a lot of that, and we can actually trace a lot of those things. Another thing that the Tower of Babel does is it explains people groups. Now, different language families and different families then exit Tower of Babel and they go to different parts of the world. Think of it like this. Let's say me and my wife and my kids, let's say we leave here and we go to some isolated place. Believe it or not, all the descendants of me and my wife, the only traits that they can pick from are things that came from me and my wife. So our look is going to have a general influence on all of our descendants. In other words, as people left the Tower of Babel and go to settle in different parts of the world, people who went to the Orient took genes for an almond-shaped eye, for example, and that helps explain why that particular area, the descendants had that. So, it probably went back to an ancestor that had some of that. People went to Africa, took genes for darker skin. People went to Europe, took genes for lighter skin. And I wonder if we see that as a reflection going all the way back to Noah's 3 sons, potentially Noah's 3 sons' wives. But that's important in our culture today. And the reason this is so important is, I hate to say it this way, but all around the world we see massive forms of racism. We are in a culture that has been taught that we evolved out of Africa from lower life forms, from some ape-like creatures. Some people had evolved more, some people had evolved less. Darwin talked about this. Ernst Haeckel talked about these sort of things. And, sometimes they would lump people into as many as 4 races. Sometimes I've heard them, list as high as 50 races or so. Darwin at least believed there was 2 races, if not more than that. So, that has been imposed on generations of people, that there are higher and lower races. Typically, the way Darwin did it, he put kind of the Caucasian on top. That's the way Ernst Haeckel did it. And they would put people with darker skin lower at the bottom because they, according to him, hadn't evolved far enough from the apes. Now, that has carried over into modern culture. And so we see that. In fact, we see a lot of different forms of racism. Here in the United States, we've seen a lot of racism between dark skin, light skin. We see a lot with Asians that have come over, or with the Native Americans. We see a lot. When I was down in Australia, I saw a lot of racism. A lot of times people would say it was from the Europeans and the Aborigines, going back and forth. But we also see a lot from people from the Orient that have moved down. I was over in Sweden. I saw a lot of forms of racism there from immigrants that had come in. We see a lot of forms of it. Now, how does the Tower of Babel help solve that? If we go back to the Tower of Babel, all the people at the Tower of Babel are descendants of Noah. And Noah is ultimately a descendant of Adam and Eve. Noah is our great-grandfather. Adam and Eve is our great-grandfather. Hey, if we all go back to just 2 people, how many races of mankind are there? 1. The human race, I like to say. A lot of people like to say Adam's race. There's only 1 race. So this whole concept of racism, it comes from an entirely different religion, a humanistic religion. What we need to do is encourage people to go back to the Bible. There's only 1 race, the human race. In fact, they've recently, well, it's not been recent now. We used to say that, but the human genome has been mapped. And guess what? They said, they were surprised actually to find that there was only 1 race, the human race. And that's exciting to see. It's nice to see some of the science catching up to what the Bible says. But what we need to do, as Christians, we need to be leading this fight out there saying, hey, these people are our relatives. Yeah, we have variations. Yeah, some people are taller, some people are shorter, some people have dark hair, lighter hair, darker skin, lighter skin, different shape eyes. But this is just variations within the human race. We are all related. We need to start looking at each other like we're related and start to care for each other like we're related, because that's extremely important. And that's one of the ways to battle against racism. When you have a proper biblical understanding of different peoples and different people groups as they went to different parts of the world, it is fascinating. It really helps open your eyes to look at people the correct way.